cannot believe that someone like a Huberman is not conscious that, oh, this is just a rodent study, that looked at something. Um, Anyone with any degree of scientific training or understanding of the epistemology of the scientific method would take to a public platform consumed by hundreds of thousands of people and represent that study as a prescriptive behavior that someone could do. There's absolutely no way he doesn't know that that is gross misrepresentation of research.
How does somebody navigate social media and all these things that are being thrown at us now in terms of how to optimize your nutrition, how to optimize everything? Because it feels like every week there's a new study that's open to interpretation, or maybe not done particularly well, or being grabbed
Mm.
by someone who's trying to sell something. It feels overwhelming, even for someone like me who's been relatively immersed in the industry, albeit at an amateur level, for a while. It does feel a little bit overwhelming. So how can somebody navigate all of this influx of information and being told this is the way, this is the optimal way to do this is the optimal way to do that?
Ah, I think that the biggest gift someone can give themselves is actually to try and tune as much of it out as possible. There's a really broad heuristic that we can apply here. If people on social media are, hyper focused on one specific factor, if they're hyper focused on specific foods and they're using words like toxic and this kind of thing, and these are all red flags. Um, if they are, talking about really kind of cool sounding science and even using phrases like the studies show whatever, with big claims attached to them, but actually if you really listen it kind of all sounds a bit opaque and not particular, that's a red flag. So I can think of a number of examples. I can think of this one, the glucose goddess, right? Her whole thing is just showing people perfectly normal physiological glucose responses and pathologizing them to make people think there's a problem. So that's an example of hyper focus on one specific thing absent other context. That's a red flag. Um, Andrew Huberman's a really good example of someone who sounds sciency, but is just pulling everyone's leg with, if you actually looked at the science that is supposed to be supporting these claims, it's a random rodent study, it's a speculative mechanistic study. It's not robust, but it sounds sexy when he's saying you get a 2000% increase in dopamine from something, and everyone goes, "Woo, I want more dopamine." So I guess if it sounds sensationalist, if it's myopically focused on one specific factor, if it's someone with their shirt off in a supermarket shouting at foods, it's a red flag. And it's amazing to me that people don't see this. It's amazing to me that even without any sort of grounding in science or scientific, methodology or otherwise, that people wouldn't look at something like that and be like, this is a red flag, rather than, wow, I'm going to listen to what this person is saying about vegetable oils.
So
It
what do you think?
blows my mind.
What's that more down to? Sorry to jump in, but is that more down to the average person's knowledge level being so low that these things are just readily accepted? Or is it the fact that we're seeing the emergence of these kind of social media scientists who have amazing credentials in their field, or
Mm.
work at an incredibly reputable facility, and they bring with them a load of kind of trust and authority to subjects? And you've been very vocal in your criticism of Andrew Huberman,
Mm-hmm.
and the glucose goddess, and they, especially with Dr. Huberman, coming at it with an enormous amount of respect and
Oh,
authority.
he's a tenured professor at Stanford.
So this is I guess this is my question is, why have you been so vocal? Is it because there is that added element of trust or authority where somebody comes from a respected position,
Mhm.
even though they're now maybe potentially, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but straying out of their lane in terms of the advice they're giving?
they're straying out of their lane, but they're also deliberately. I cannot believe for a second that someone with his, if we're sticking with Huberman as an example, someone with his kind of background, I cannot believe for a second that he doesn't realize that he's misrepresenting poor quality or speculative levels of research into prescriptive behaviors you should do. And I can't believe that's anything but deliberate.
So why is he doing it?
Because it's clout. Because he's as I called him once, he's Joe Rogan with p values. You know, he's a slightly more credible bro because of and so to your question, I think we've really got two different sides that I typically see. One is, yes, the authority bias. So someone like an Andrew Huberman or a Tim Spector, they're credentialed, they're academic, they have affiliations, they publish, you know, they're active publishing researchers, and yet they've hopped in at the opportunity to commercialize their position, basically, to commercialize their and commodify their contributions, essentially to commodify their authority bias. And so I think that you have a type of person on social media that very unwittingly falls for that authority bias, and assumes this person appears credible. Therefore, I expect that what they're saying is accurate and true. And so they're the ones that are very misled in a lot of this. Then when it comes to the kind of other side, the what I would say is like deliberately or sorry, very clearly unhinged, you know, a Paul Saladino, for example, and some of these kind of carnivore or other kind of very extreme diet, quack Liver King and otherwise. I think that's a different type of ilk or different segment of the internet that typically, in my experience, the people who buy into that are actually part of an overall picture of very kind of anti-authority, conspiratorial thinking. So people that buy into, say, Liver King or otherwise, they don't just have that belief about diet in isolation. Pick at them and you'll see a lot of very vehement anti-vaccine type of sentiments, you know, very prone to the government lied to us to get us to eat this way. So there's a lot of kind of conspiratorial elements that go into that aspect. And then I think on the other side, then the kind of Huberman, Spector, or other some of these kind of celebrity scientist types, I think you have this weird just place that science has entered in the public domain, and I don't know what to make of it necessarily. We saw it play out even during COVID. You know, this we have science typically has kind of just existed in the background, and has served to improve society. I mean, that's its ultimate function. You know, we have used science to improve everything from our communications technology to, you know, our ability to, you know, keep someone alive after a heart attack and all of this kind of stuff. And typically science has done that, and we've benefited from this kind of invisible hand. And now, because of social media and because of other factors, science has taken on this kind of social aspect and role, which I kind of pejoratively refer to as like the science, capital TS. And it means that kind of your average Joe now in the public who just would have got on with his life and never really thought twice about science, despite the fact that his life would have benefited or her life would have benefited from advancement in science in ways that they would have likely been unknown of. And now they're interested in this thing they call science. So everyone's talking about studies, and everyone, you know, we saw this happen during COVID, where, you know, the kind of meme became how everyone was suddenly an armchair infectious disease epidemiologist overnight. But people are very serious with this, and they expect to be taken seriously, and they expect to have their opinion weighed with as much weight as a, you know, a 40-year like actual publishing, you know, researcher in that field. So I think part of this, I don't know really how to characterize it, as this kind of socialization of science in the social media age, And it really takes science out of its role as a kind of an entity that serves society, and it actually puts science as almost subservient to social agendas and commercial agendas. And that's a strange place for it to be. And I don't know what to make of it. And I've said this on social media multiple times, that people should really just like stop being so interested in this stuff, like get new hobbies.
It's one of the reasons you're so vocal and sticking with Andrew Huberman or Tim Spector here. You've been so critical of figures like that is because it's one thing for someone to go onto Instagram and see the Liver King or Carnivore
Yeah.
MD, some of the things they're saying, and you can either like it and engage with it or take a step back. When it's a tenured professor giving this advice, is a reason you're vocal, not just the risk that an individual is going to take that information on board, but the medical profession could be. You could have GPs or physicians tuning in, accepting some of the things that are said, whether or not they're accurate or not is kind of beside the point, and then relaying that information to patients. Is that a concern?
Massively. And it's not even a hypothetical concern. I've seen it happen. I've seen the kind of adjuration essentially that Tim Spector gets amongst GPs and medical professionals. He spoke at a lifestyle medicine conference in the UK this year, and was just, again, spewing very, very unscientific positions on artificial sweeteners and sugar and stuff like this. So this is actively happening. It's disseminating into other aspects of healthcare, and it's flowing directly from his authority bias that is presented. And I'm more vocally critical of those types of characters because, in my opinion, they simply should know better. I think that, again, how do we think about science? Well, there's the body of knowledge that we produce, that's, published research and studies that have been conducted. But I also think that science, very importantly, is a way of thinking. It's a certain epistemic framework that only really operates well when it's grounded in epistemic humility and intellectual honesty. And what I see in the likes of Spector and Huberman is the actual inverse of that. It's epistemic arrogance and intellectual dishonesty, because they're using, quote unquote, the science in furtherance of their own individual, commercial and kind of, I guess, fame. And I think that's a really dangerous place for science to get to. And I think there are people who are at the vanguard of, along with some other variables that are really probably outside the scope of kind of us talking about this today, but the real erosion of the credibility and authority of science. So we're in this weird place now where we simultaneously have people really interested in this thing called science and wanting to be seen to follow, people who speak about this thing called science, but actually don't know anything about this thing called science. And at the same time, we're living in a period of very heightened anti-science sentiment across multiple other elements of society. And so, and that's not entirely without some degree of merit. We saw the way that the science, quote unquote, became weaponized during COVID, which was an infectious disease that emerged within a couple of months, and suddenly people were acting as if we had answers, and it's like, hang on a minute. And that's
how deliberate do you think some of some of the names we've talked about, the likes of Huberman and Spector, how deliberate is their misrepresentation of the science, to use the phrase, in your mind? Why do you think they're doing it? And then as a follow-up to that, just, you mentioned how dangerous it is, this misrepresentation of science, or people, the average person, feeling empowered that they are now some kind of armchair scientist because they listen to a podcast. What's the fearful end point of all this if it's unchecked, in your view?
So I think the why of it for me, really, like I've said before, I cannot believe that someone like a Huberman is not conscious that, oh, this is just a rodent study, that looked at something. anyone with any degree of scientific training or understanding of the epistemology of the scientific method would take to a public platform consumed by hundreds of thousands of people and represent that study as a prescriptive behavior that someone could do. There's absolutely no way he doesn't know that that is gross misrepresentation of research. As to the why, with Tim Spector, I think it's just so easy. The Zoe app, the Zoe, the commodification and commercialization of this personalized nutrition stuff. So his commercial ties are so clear, and his commercial gain to adopting the stances that he does. Oh, the dietary guidelines are all wrong. Everyone needs this, personalized diet. It's so clear what his agenda is. With Huberman, I think again, it's probably something similar, albeit in a different form, through the podcast and kind of revenue, and it might be just because, at the end of the day, academia is kind of difficult at the times, and no one's ever going to be wealthy from dedicating a life to science in an academic institution. And so I think really it comes back to, in different ways, the fact that this is their ability to commercialize themselves as an authority and to gain commercially from that. In terms of the repercussions potentially for this, I really don't know, but my tendency to see things through a glass half empty, and pour the rest out type of lens. I think we've got a couple of things. We've got the commercialization, obviously, of science that we've talked about, in reference to both of those characters. But there's also, the erosion of credibility in science. We're seeing in science now, again, part of this socialization aspect is we're seeing social theories and ideas being kind of forced onto science. And we see that, across, there was after the George Floyd killing, for example, there was this kind of, obviously, this massive focus on, our Black American men disproportionately killed more than any other ethnic group by police. And actually the research is really poor. It's a really poor area of research. But the answer to that, if you're really taking a scientific approach and you're trying to adjust for population numbers and all of these other potential factors, is really not that clear. And it's not all entirely suggestive that there is any kind of greater level vis-a-vis other ethnic groups, for example. That finding was considered verboten. There was only one answer. The truth was that, and so the truth is in, quotation marks, capital T. And so we entered this weird place in the last few years. Again, even with COVID, there are numerous examples where there was this assumed consensus because from a social perspective, it was the right answer, quote unquote. And that's science is compromised once it goes down that road. And so my worry is that whatever flaws science has, and it has them, and they're largely institutional flaws. They're not flaws with the method, the scientific method. They're flaws with how the institutions operate and publishing and all of this, kind of murky world of kind of, journals charging exorbitant amounts to publish papers, and predatory journals, pay for play journals. I can envisage a point where science essentially, and with this citizen scientist rise, as you described, I just think we may get to a point where it's meaningless, essentially, and where, similar to the way that the media went, we end up where science is supposed to help us separate fact from fiction. We end up with science itself blurring fact and fiction. And once we get to that point, then the entire project is gone. And that will be a scary time.
Last question. we've spoken about the Huberman Lab podcast, and I think one thing he's done very well is when he does have criticism, he will engage with that critic. He'll even invite them on to the podcast, and I think you get the feeling that if there's an admission that there's been a mistake, it's kind of innocent and move on, and that adds to the aura of credibility and authority.
Mm.
It's going to be the problem with social media and with science podcasts or social media scientists, where if they do engage or they invite you onto the podcast, you're going to say yes because of the huge audience. You might leave some of your misgivings to one side because you know that you're going to be speaking to a lot of people, and you might have a book or you might have an app or you might have whatever. How positive or optimistic are you that we can begin to turn the tide and get more credible information out there, or do you feel like that, that the ship has sailed and it's just...
Yeah. Oh, well, I've only actually ever seen Huberman do that once, and it was with Lane Norton. And, I didn't see much of any sort of like challenge because of the subject matter was very much more on kind of like, you know, like some of the kind of like weight loss, like body composition type, I don't think, I don't think I really saw that much of a challenge to a
But then
lot of his wider stuff.
you invited Dr. Norton onto the podcast, though, right? Which, even if
Yeah. Yeah.
there
True.
hasn't been an acknowledgement of the criticism from a onlooker point of view, all is well in that world.
Yes, yes, yes. So it does seem to kind of, yeah, have this veneer, I guess, of the kind of humility side. But like, I still, I think this exists within a culture where the horse is already bolted from the stable. I think we're always going to be vastly outnumbered by, and even recently, this guy, Stephen Bartlett, who I'd never heard of until he started platforming, just uncredible nutrition health people, one after the other, and platforming, and yet on an enormous platform.
Mm-hmm.
So as long as a Stephen Bartlett or a Joe Rogan or an Andrew, like we're just putting out little fires in a game that is unwinnable. And it's a case of whack-a-mole, really is. And so I don't see any victory, so to speak, for real science and really kind of just credible, sound information, largely because it's not particularly sexy. It's not going to sell a book. It's not going to launch an enormous platform. So I think that the best that we can do is try and carve out little corners of the internet where people who genuinely do want knowledge, not for the sake of its sensationalism, but for the sake of its veracity and accuracy and honesty, end up being able to find a home to. And I have, I've a lot of conversations where I've flirted with the merits of kind of being engaged in a public facing context. And there's always, that reinforcement from the audience that, well, I'm not here for bullshit. I'm not here. I'm here for understanding genuine science and what this says or does not say, even if the ultimate take-home message is as boring as exercise and eat fruit and vegetables. And so that's reinforcing to me. But I think the reality of it is, and I say this to other science communicators, let's be really much more honest and open about the fact that this is an unwinnable fight. We're fighting a rearguard action, and we have lost. And so the purpose of this rearguard action is to simply save as many other people who are open to being saved as we can.
So we get off this call now, you open your inbox, there's an email from Andrew at thehubermanlab.com inviting you on. Are you going?
I would go, of course, but we would be having a hard conversation that I hope would be had in the spirit of science and in that spirit of intellectual honesty and humility that, again, would allow some of these concerns to be put to him in a sense.
What's your first question to him?
That's my first question. I think I'd be something framing it something along the lines of what I've just said to you, is that idea that I have that this is, you have to know that this is deliberate, that there's no one that has any sort of understanding of the basic hierarchy of evidence that takes a rodent study and turns it into prescriptive advice. Um, and you know otherwise he's just, I don't know, it's so long ago since he did basic scientific, epistemology and methods that he's just forgotten it all. I don't know, but I think it would be something along those lines. Like, help me to understand why it is that you're making these claims.